It is not change that I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is development, growth. I don't mean growth in the business sense. I mean growth of human potentialities. I mean growth of human spirit. I mean growth of human contact. That is ecological. To develop is what is really ecological. To change can mean anything. The question is, what is the end toward which you want to develop? What is the goal that you're trying to realize? And then afterward, whether or not you have developed to that goal, which is what biology is concerned with. It is not concerned merely with change. What is beautiful are people. What is beautiful is the ecosystems and their integrity in which we live. What is beautiful is the soil that we share with the rest of the world of life, and particularly that special bit of soil in which we feel we have some degree of stewardship. It is not only what is small that is beautiful, it is what is ecological that is beautiful, what is human that is beautiful. Ecology must begin. Social ecology must begin with a love of place. There must be home. Home, ecology, the study of the household. If we do not have a household, and that household is not an organic, rich community, if we do not know the land we live on, if we do not understand its soil, if we do not understand the people we live with, if we cannot relate to them, then at that particular point, we are really out in a void. Ecology must begin with a very deep understanding of the interaction between people and the interaction between where you come from, what you love, what is the land that you love. I don't mean the country or the state. I'm talking about the land that you may occupy. It may even be a village, it may be a city, it may be a farmstead. But first and foremost, without those roots that place you in nature and in a specific form of nature, it is a deception to talk about cosmic oneness. It is a deception even to talk about ecosystems without having this sense of unity with your immediate locale, with your soil, with your community, with your home. Ecology believes in a genuine harmonization of humanity with nature, and that harmonization of humanity with nature depends fundamentally upon the harmonization of human beings with each other.
As a young man radicalized at the age of 9, Murray Bookchin eventually formulated and enriched a comprehensive theory called social ecology, with the express goal of improving society and the planet. But what exactly is social ecology? And for that matter, why does humanity need to transform our existing society anyway?
Social ecology is a critical social theory that my father developed over many years, but really that took shape in the 1960s, I would say. And at the heart of social ecology is really the idea that you can't think about how we're going to heal our rapacious attitude towards the natural world, which has wreaked so much destruction and havoc, which we're seeing now with global warming, but in so many other ways as well, that you cannot heal that relationship until you change social relations, so that the social relations of hierarchy, domination, and just general oppression that we see in so many aspects of modern society, status, class issues, that those things must be transformed in order for us to transform our domineering attitude towards nature. So social ecology tries to evaluate different ways that we can interact on the human level, and says that once we actually create new societies that are liberatory, that are egalitarian, that are not exploitive, and that are particularly not based on capitalism, because capitalism above all is a mechanism of domination and hierarchy and exploitation, that in order to end that exploitation of nature, once we've done that on the social level, we will be able to essentially heal our relationship with the natural world.
Capitalism by its very nature has to expand, it has to accumulate, it has to grow. So much like the ideology of a cancer cell, it eventually will eat its own host, whether it's people, whether it's the environment, whether it's the planet. It ultimately is self-undermining, and I think we're starting to see that manifest in the ongoing social breakdown. There's folks sleeping underneath the bridge just behind me. We're right here on the waterfront. Sea levels continue to rise. It's getting hotter and hotter. There's less and less ice in the glaciers every summer. Massive forest fires, increasing intensity, increasing frequency. So we face really, truly a series of interlocking crises: economic, political, social, racial, and gender. And we just are really facing crisis of the age, and not enough ideas, not enough visionary ideas to confront it. So, and I think people are increasingly intuitively grasping that.
The Riverside fire has scorched more than 40,000 acres.
So as more of these methane bursts occur, they will release more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere.
To release radioactive water from the tsunami-wrecked Fukushima nuclear plant into the ocean.
Stop telling people that everything will be fine.
These large chasms of ice and rock are melting at an unprecedented rate.
Higher water is changing their local landscape.
59 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. That's how much the U.S. Defense Department spewed into the atmosphere.
More than 620,000 waking up without power in Texas this morning.
Texas Senator Ted Cruz jetted off to sunny Cancun.
Who can't put food on the table, who can't pay the rent.
And we represent them. And we represent them.
As miles-long lines like these wrap around food banks.
The United States is facing the greatest eviction crisis we have ever seen in our country's history.
The last 15, 20 years, you can see rents have been increasing considerably, whereas incomes have remained relatively stagnant.
As millions lose their jobs, they also lose their health care coverage.
1/3 of their crowdfunding campaigns right now are for people to pay their medical bills.
There was an audible gasp in the audience. People were just like absolutely dejected.
Yet they have some of the highest water bills in the country. Is that fair?
I don't think it's fair, but it's unfortunately right now it's a financial reality.
The idea that everyone should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, only look out for themselves, and see everyone else as competition.
The so-called stimulus bill. It's too little and it's too late.
Donc on aimerait bien, on nous annonce à chaque fois la crise, mais enfin la crise au gouvernement n'existe pas.
If we continue to destroy the environment, future pandemics like these could become more likely.
Understand today, but tomorrow you're leaving.
Congress is deadlocked on COVID relief, but came together to fund the Pentagon for $740 billion.
I'm guided by the beauty of our weapons, and they are beautiful pictures.
Many children. The youngest was just 3 months old.
Local officers are now inclined to think like soldiers.
U.S. missiles that are made of depleted uranium, and the radiation in some of these areas were 2,000 times higher.
We left troops behind only for the oil.
The chemical smell of the injuries and the burned shapes all suggest they were caused by white phosphorus.
Essentially, neoliberalism, which begins in the 1970s with an assault on working people, on an assault on the standard of living that had been generated by very slow incremental gains by especially the labor movement in the last 40, 50 years, starts to be unraveled. And I think that's really an important point of genesis if we want to trace back the current crisis. Since then, we saw wages going into decline. What covered up the rest? Debt, massive debt, credit card debt, healthcare debt, now student debt, which I think is the largest form of debt in the United States, all of which has just made it increasingly difficult for just regular working people in the United States and around the world to sustain themselves. People that are angry because they've played by the rules and now they see very diminished life expectation. The contemporary capitalist system is not working even for the people that it's been promised to work for, and I think that realization has crashed down hard. Unfortunately, I think at the same time, this has coincided with a global retrenchment of left-wing politics, of the idea of emancipatory, egalitarian, redistributive politics has really been under assault during that same period by neoliberalism, which proclaimed loudly and forcefully that there is no alternative, that another world is not possible. And of course, we've seen glimmers of resistance in the last 40 years. I mean, one that comes sharply to mind is the ultra-globalization movement, which at least its North American entree happened right here in Seattle in 1999 when 50,000 unionists and 10 to 20,000 direct actionists shut down the World Trade Organization summit here, said that we will not put profit before people. It was a very inspiring coalition of so-called Teamsters and Turtles, of union activists, of environmentalists, of faith-based groups, anti-racist groups, anarchists, ecologists, etc., coming together to really question this unending drive, this mantra that began, well, it has a long history, but we can say Reagan put it very forcefully, that we just need to run society like a business. We need to put business and its interests in the driver's seat, and somehow that will all trickle down. And even in the 1990s, when there was still a dot-com and a housing bubble, there was relative affluence fueled mostly by debt. Well, the next big upsurge happens in 2011 with the Occupy Wall Street movement, which again changes the conversation, so to speak, about income inequality, about class, about the nature of capitalism, that American workers are working longer and harder, corporations are more productive than ever, but that wealth is just not trickling down. In fact, it's trickling up into fewer and fewer hands, and it becomes increasingly difficult just for people to sustain themselves, let alone to plan for the future. So we've seen a real reversal of the fortunes of our parents and our parents' parents' generation. that I think is fueling a lot of discontent. And that's precisely because there was a bipartisan consensus on the neoliberal assumptions of the global order for the last 40 years. And this was in many ways a global phenomenon, but in the United States it encompassed both the left and the right, the quote-unquote left and the right, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, believed in free markets. They believed in global trade, reducing barriers, pushing down living standards by suppressing unions, et cetera, et cetera. So you have, this sets the stage for the political crisis of faith we've had in the last especially 10, 15 years, where people there's no representatives that speak for the typical working class American. Nobody is speaking to this. They're actually on the same team. It often takes the form of a discourse of corruption, which again in some ways is problematic because I think it focuses too much on the personal attributes of the people in power rather than looking at it as a structural systemic problem. So I think it's the right that's been very good at tapping into this, channeling this anger, to use Trump's slogan, channeling it backwards to a mythical past to make America great again, when America, never really worked for everyone equally. You see this across Europe with, appeals to a mythical national identity that was, exclusive, nativist, nationalist, militarist, etc., building fences, borders, walls rather than tearing them down, so that you have a kind of very confused, very backwards critique of some of the effects of neoliberalism that focus only on the migration, the multiculturalism, the diversity, the tolerance that is a byproduct in some parts of global trade and increased interaction. But going with this really backwards, reactionary counter-reaction to that, and we've had only fits and starts of an alternative to that, of what could really put a growing political economy that worked for everyone, that also didn't pit nature and the very survival of our ecosystem, which of course as humans we depend on, didn't pit that against jobs, that looked at things like increasing automation not as something that should be feared and hated, but rather embraced, that increasing automation should mean in a more utopian register that we all work less, that we all have more time for our families, our friends, our hobbies, that we don't need to create busy work. We do not need to have dirty, meaningless jobs that are dangerous, that are bad for the environment. We need to actually think beyond this. Instead, it seems that at the current historical moment, people are looking backwards. They're fetishizing a very backwards, mythic past that never really existed. So, given that is a very dangerous and disheartening moment for many, like at the present, we need to think forward.
Social ecology is an idealistic philosophy that attempts to draw some of the best concepts from the left tradition, like the radical democratic, feminist, anarchist, socialist, and communist. Traditions that have tried to offer a politics of liberating humanity, but have fallen short in various ways. Social ecology attempts to bring them together into something new while avoiding the authoritarian outcomes of past radical left and socialist movements. To grasp the root of social ecology, we must first dig into these past ideologies and understand the best of their foundational concept.
What is anarchism? Anarchism is a social movement for anti-state socialism. Socialism referring to means of production held in common, in some kind of way self-managed between people. Anarchism is distinct from a broader history of opposition to hierarchy, but it is important to note that various groups and tendencies in history share some or even many of anarchism's features. And this is in part due to anarchists very consciously drawing on a broader history of freedom when the ideals of anarchism were formed. Proudhon, Bakunin, and Kropotkin, three major anarchist theorists that had a lot of influence on the anarchist movement. Proudhon developed a kind of anarchism based around developing mutual credit associations, cooperatives, and the like. Such features were to bloom and expand in an evolutionary way to then create a new society. Some people even argue that this is really a kind of proto-anarchism as opposed to anarchism proper, despite Proudhon coining the term anarchism as a political term. Chronologically after Proudhon, Bakunin favored collectivized means of production and dwellings as opposed to more isolated cooperatives and units. And additionally, Bakunin favored revolution as opposed to the more gradual approach of Proudhon. And alongside his comrades, Bakunin helped to develop the essential features of what revolutionary anarchism would become. Kropotkin favored anarchist communism, where means of production were held in common and distributed according to needs, irrespective of individual labor input. Kropotkin was also a scientist, geographer, ethicist, Renaissance person of sorts. His arguments were some of the most well-articulated and persuasive and coherent among early anarchists, and they even shine through today as exceptional. Anarchism later developed into multiple kinds thereof, each favoring different conceptions of where to go and how to get there. Tendencies within anarchism involved communal associations and/or radical unions as the major ways to get towards a good society. This approach was based on developing these horizontal structures and institutions to meet people's needs, to oppose hierarchical power, and then have a revolution, overthrow class property, and develop common means of production. Other tendencies focused more so on an insurrectionary approach, with informal affinity groups that would develop stateless socialism through a series of insurrections. Other tendencies, although more marginal, focused on merely building cooperatives and the like, similar to Proudhon's politics, or individual lifestyle changes, or even pacifism. Before 1940, anarchism and social movements connected to anarchism helped to develop multiple revolutions. This includes the Zapatistas, the Free Territory, Shinmin Prefecture, and of course the anarcho-syndicalist revolution in Spain. These revolutions all had distinct successes and flaws, but they all developed radically egalitarian organizations, helped meet people's needs, increased the range of freedom for people, and helped contribute to overall well-being of people, before of course they were quashed by external hierarchies. Anarchists also participated in many movements for short-term gains, advocating for using direct democracy, direct action, and mutual aid in the process of achieving more short-term goals. After 1940, anarchism continued, of course, and has had an influence on tons of social movements for a better world. But most anywhere there's a struggle for freedom in the world, anarchists and practices influenced by anarchism will usually be involved to some extent, if not at the tip of the spear.
Isn't it swell? Boy, will I have something to tell the fellas tomorrow.
I was a victim too. At least my wife was. She had friends who were socialists.
Oh my God.
Well, we all make mistakes.
What is socialism? To me, the way I think about it, it's a society that the basic needs of people are met. That's one part of it. Food, health, transportation, communication, education, housing, all of those basic needs are met. Secondly, to me, it's a society that production is organized, again, around meeting these needs, not for profit. A third part of socialism, in my understanding, is that the means of production, what's used to produce goods and services, are socially owned and not owned by individuals to make profit. So, for example, in my view, you couldn't be a landlord because that's owning housing to make money on it, but you could, of course, have personal property. So basically, capitalist property would be socialized, but people would have their own, they could have your own toothbrush house, etc. And then, to me, socialism and democracy in a real sense can't be separated. So I see it meaning at the level of the workplace, controlled by workers over productions, ideas of workers' councils, there's real work control over production, and as well at the community level, people are deciding how to run their communities, which to me means some form of participatory planning or democratic planning it doesn't mean central planning from above, nor just letting the market decide. So to me, those are very key aspects of socialism, which I differentiate from social democracy. Often those terms are seen interchangeably, and to me, social democracy is preferable to the kind of economy the United States has now, which I call neoliberal. But social democracy, to me, is a very, very regulated form of capitalism, where it's an attempt to make income more equal than the market does, where some of the basic needs, such as health and education, are not commodities, maybe exist for everybody, and just by living in society, you have a right to that. On the other hand, most production is still done by corporations for profit. And in that society, unlike my view of socialism, labor is still very alienated. Basically, people have little control over their workplace, not democratic control of the workplace. You might think of social democracy like some of the Scandinavian countries, or I would call Bernie Sanders. I think it's a very interesting campaign. It's confusing because he called himself a democratic socialist, but to me, his programs, his ideas, very much what I would call social democracy. So in finishing, I'm giving a pretty purist view of socialism. I would say at least it's a movement in that direction, a society that's moving there, a society that has some of the aspects I just pointed out, like basically production for need, social control of production, etc.
And lecture the Congress about how we have to cut Social Security.
The Bernie Sanders movement ushered in a seemingly ultramodern campaign of socialist thought. Unfortunately, not able to combat the strong arm of crony capitalism and neoliberalism that infects our politics, Bernie eventually capitulated and fell in line with those he criticized, leaving his fervent supporters completely dejected.
So I think Bernie is important as a representation of what a different politics might look like. And given the fact that his own party infrastructure was against him, the media was against him. I mean, I was reading the New York Times during this last election cycle, and it was often read like the old Russian propaganda rag, Pravda, that you'd have like 10 articles out of the top 15 that were basically just railing against Bernie Sanders and his completely unrealistic political program of democratic socialism.
Mr. Sanders is suddenly promising not just a few stars here and there, but the moon and a good part of the sun. From free college tuition paid for with giant tax hikes and a huge increase in government health care, which has made even liberal Democrats skeptical.
So clearly, the ruling class in this country was in a panic, and it was quite inspiring to see millions and millions of people around the country donate their money and feel a part of this growing movement, which was quashed internally through the DNC.
Although the Bernie Sanders campaign was suppressed by the DNC and the business elite, the damage had already been done. A growing number of Americans, young and old, are now in support of these quote-unquote socialist programs, like a single-payer healthcare system, student loan forgiveness, tuition-free college, $15 minimum wage, the Green New Deal, breaking up the big banks, and paid family leave.
Virtually everywhere socialism or communism has been tried, it has produced suffering, corruption, and decay. Socialism's thirst for power leads to expansion, incursion, and oppression. All nations of the world should resist socialism and the misery that it brings to everyone.
When we think about these kind of failed experiments with socialism and communism that people unfortunately have tarnished the historical legacy of the left, they think of the Soviet Union, they think of China, they think of the whole history of authoritarian socialism, or what some call state socialism. Well, it's worth pointing out a few things about these countries. Of course, they exist in a broader world capitalist economy, so the word state socialist implies that they in fact are entities in competition with other capitalist actors in the global market. So the idea of socialism in one country is proven to be often rather false.
So again, I've been to Venezuela a few times. I took classes there from Evergreen. And there were really some major advances in the population, incredible increases in public education, where you had, for really the first time, large numbers of people in popular classes going to these new universities. Literacy campaigns, which I didn't mention in Cuba, just amazing literacy campaign where people went to live with people to teach them to read and write.
Bolivia and Venezuela are celebrating their country's progress against illiteracy during International Literacy Day this Monday. Venezuela is marking 7 years as illiteracy-free.
There were real improvements in people's lives, and I would call it maybe consumer sovereignty, like people having a lot of control, having needs met, poverty rates declining by over half in Venezuela. Venezuela becoming, in terms of income inequality, leaving aside Cuba's statistics not that good, the most equal country in the Americas, more equal than the United States, which I know isn't a very high standard, but still, given how unequal Latin America is. So there were real improvements, but still production was either private and a lot of the goods were imported for very complicated reasons about their currency being overvalued. It became much cheaper to buy goods from abroad than to produce them at home, and also it was almost impossible to sell goods abroad. So you basically had an oil-based economy, but I would say never socialist. You could say moving in that direction, but the majority of production, both in the period where I was, let's say 2012, the last time, and today, was mainly private production for profit. You had also state production, like the oil. Venezuela has either the largest, second largest reserves of oil in the world, and the oil money really trickled down in major ways to the population, like these education missions and misiones that I was just mentioning, where people who go to school, elementary, middle school, high school, college, those with money from the oil. Similarly, the health clinics, they had health clinics all over the country, and doctors before had mainly been in the richer areas, and a lot of that got either funded by the oil or Cuban doctors going to Venezuela to set up these clinics in poor communities. But see, production, in terms of production, never really grew in a major way. It was neither socialist in terms of worker community controlled, nor did it grow sufficiently, and very, very different from any of Marx's writings about socialism and communism.
Communism in reality is not a political party. It is a way of life, an evil and malignant way of life. It reveals a condition akin to disease that spreads like an epidemic, and like an epidemic, a quarantine is necessary to keep it from infecting this nation.
The term communism is also not so easy to define. I usually talk about communism with a capital C versus a small c. Okay, so communism with a small c is very much like what I call socialism. It basically, I think of some of the writings of Karl Marx, who didn't write a whole lot about socialism or communism. I think that's the misconception. He basically, most of his writing was an analysis and critique of capitalism. He talked about, like in some of his writings, a critique of the Gotha program. What I called socialism, or what he called socialism, was sometimes called the lowest stage of communism, the transition between capitalism and communism, where people got paid how much they produced. So that was socialism, or the lowest stage of communism. He used those two terms interchangeably. Marx, he, for most of his writing, believed that socialism would come about in a country, in his terms, where the productive forces are very developed. In other words, where the technology, people's skills, machinery would be very developed, and they can really no longer develop under capitalism. And you would develop a working class, the large majority of the population, that would understand that the existing society no longer could meet people's needs. It had the potential to, but not the actuality. And that people would develop the consciousness, the understanding to overthrow capitalism and develop the socialism and communism in a kind of very, I guess, just, equal, and democratic society that I talked about a little bit earlier. Communism, the full-fledged version, which I say communism with a small c, which I find very attractive, but it's a hard word to use because of the negative connotations. It's a society where people would get paid according to the need. There'd be an idea of rotation of people would do different kinds of jobs. Society where people really control the society. To me, it's again where the democracy in a real sense and socialism in a real sense come together. A society that moves beyond alienation. And communism with a capital C has been a society that first developed in some kind of ways in 1917 and what became the Soviet Union. It's a society that, to me, is not a capitalist society. Production is not organized for profit. It's more or less controlled by the state with a communist party in control. And a lot of those societies have collapsed, and it's a society that tends to have central planning becoming somewhat top-down. What was important was developing, again, what Marx called productive forces, technology, industrialization, with no concern about what I call social relations, how production is organized, relations among workers. Became a totally top-down form of production, very authoritarian, very hierarchical.
We are now equipped with a new understanding for why the current examples of socialism, anarchism, and communism do not adhere to their authentic meaning in history. Plagued by authoritarian decree, crushed by tyrannical rule, and suffocated by a global capitalist framework, these ideologies practiced from the shores of Venezuela to the farthest reaches of China all share one malady that exemplifies their failures: hierarchy. So what exactly does hierarchy mean, and how did it evolve into this global dilemma at the heart of our ecological collapse?
Well, in anthropology, in a technical sense, a hierarchy is defined as an institutionalized relationship of command and control that ultimately has recourse to physical coercion. And that's certainly true of hierarchies in human society. When we look at the emergence of hierarchy, I think we have to recognize that it emerged in different ways at different times in different places. And there are many different theoretical perspectives on that. I mean, one can see hierarchy potentially emerging as populations came up against their limits and began to expand out into other human populations, territories, requiring perhaps a warrior class to defend territory or to conquer territory. Warriors might have established themselves as a hierarchy. We can perhaps see the emergence of hierarchy with the replacement of more kinds of female-centric values, matriarchal values by more patriarchal outlooks, as once again perhaps warriors began to take on a more important role. We can see hierarchy perhaps emerging out of the earliest forms of spirituality. The shaman, who was really a part-time magico-religious specialist, using their influence and their power to establish themselves as a more full-time religious elite, which organized itself hierarchically to exploit the labor of others. I don't think there's any single path. At the same time, I don't think that it's inevitable that hierarchies emerge. Certainly we see many, many cultures in which other forms of leadership emerged. I think that leadership is a quality which most human societies possess, but in non-hierarchical societies, leadership, instead of being institutionalized, totalistic, and enforced by physical coercion, ultimately takes the form of a leader being someone who has experience, knowledge, wisdom, perhaps a kind of charisma that inspires others, that exhorts others, but can't ever really force others to follow their will. We're led in our society believe that human nature consists of a very narrow set of possibilities, that it's human nature to be greedy, to be acquisitive, to be violent, to create hierarchies. And certainly, that's a part of who we are. We know that because that's the society we exist in today. But if we look at the anthropological record, once again, and anthropologists, in fact, don't even use the term human nature anymore. Instead, we talk about the human potential. And human potential is very broad. And while it does contain the potential, the possibility of being violent, acquisitive, greedy, etc., it also contains the potential for being caring, for sharing, for nurturance, for creating mutualistic kinds of relationships between people. And we know that we have that potential because other cultures, other societies have based themselves on those principles. What's really pernicious about capitalism is that it's a system that instead reinforces those ugliest aspects of the human potential, reinforces them and rewards them. It's really humanity as a species that has the potential to transform ecosystems on a massive scale, and to do so in very destructive ways. And that's an outgrowth, from the perspective of social ecology, of our social relations. We see that the attempt to dominate other people, the creation of hierarchical institutions, the imposition of various economic forms like capitalism, particularly on a society, have a very destructive effect. And those are very much social problems. So that what we see as environmental problems, when we look at things like oil spills, obviously, when we look at various forms of point pollution, when we look at chemicals in the food, when we look at water and what's happened to our water supplies, those are problems that grow out of humanity. And for us, they're a direct result of the kinds of hierarchical relationships that our particular society has put forth as a model. And we see the domination of nature growing quite directly out of the domination of people. And capitalism is the ultimate expression of that. I don't want to suggest that earlier cultures didn't also create environmental problems, but nothing on the scale that exists today. And once again, I don't want to suggest we would go back to hunting and gathering. We wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to. We couldn't. But we can take those same principles that inform those cultures, and we can find ways to institutionalize them. We can find ways to create new forms of economics, which are based on a very different set of principles than capitalism, and that reward very different kinds of behavior, and that socialize and educate people in those very different forms of behavior. Now, as to how we will achieve that, I think it's going to require a revolutionary movement, a real transformation of some of the underlying principles that inform our culture and our society.
Social ecology is a constellation of political ideas that I think offers a very compelling framework for thinking our way out of the current crisis.
Social ecology is a critical social theory, but it's also a reconstructive social theory. It looks at what society is doing right now that enforces domination and hierarchy. So it's an anti-capitalist philosophy, and it's also a philosophy based very much on freedom. And it really asks the question, what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean? How do we interact with the natural world? What does it mean to have non-exploitive relationships? How can we institute the values of mutual aid and cooperation? And the word ecology is very critical there, because from ecology we get this important sense of cooperation and diversity, or what my father called unity and diversity. The idea that those ecological systems are most stable that are most complex.
In natural systems, we see that the greater the number of species interacting at various trophic levels, the more stable that ecosystem is. So that very complex ecosystems, like rainforests and estuaries, which have large numbers of species and many species at each trophic level, have incredible resilience. They have an ability to survive fluctuations in any one species. Even if a species goes extinct, there are other species filling that niche and allowing for that system to retain a degree of stability. Though I would emphasize that it's not static, it's not unchanging, it's a kind of diversity and unity which is homeostatic, which is self-regulating, which is a dynamic. And we see, on the contrary, when ecosystems are simplified, when species are extracted, it's very easy for an ecosystem to collapse. So that's, in biological terms, what the concept of unity and diversity means. In human terms, we see human society as really echoing those same dynamics, that the more diverse a culture, the more diverse numbers of ethnic groups, the more diverse ideas, the more diverse and complex this culture is, the more stable and the more dynamic it is.
And in the same way, a society is most stable when it's most complex. And that's, one reason why this sort of whole tendency that we're seeing right now as we get towards more and more authoritarian regimes all over the world, and here even in the United States, of homogeneity, of wanting to exclude people, goes completely against the ideals of social ecology. Social ecology says that really to have an ecosystem that's stable, it has to be diverse. It depends on cooperation. It depends on a form of, in a certain sense, what you would call, at least on the human level, mutual aid. That's how people survive. That's how species survive. And that's how we really need to reinvent society so that we are allowing as many people as possible to have as free and creative a life as possible.
It's going to certainly have to find political expression, but also economic expression. And I think basically the politics of social ecology suggests that there are three different ways that will happen. First, through oppositional movements, protest movements that recognize the destructive nature of capitalism, particularly in relation to the environment, but that alone is not sufficient. At the same time, simultaneously, we need to create alternatives. We need to actualize those new forms. We need to find ways to institutionalize them. We have to create cooperatives. We have to create alternative energy sources that are owned and controlled by community that don't require the same kind of destructive, extractive technologies that we're using today. But once again, not sufficient. We know that cooperatives can easily be swallowed up by capitalism. Various local initiatives can very easily be subsumed by the state. We know that the state does retain a monopoly ultimately on violence, the enforcement of those hierarchical relationships that exist today. So we need to find a way to contest that as well. And that's really the third aspect of the politics of social ecology, which is political. We really need to create new political forms that can begin to contest with the state for power. And I think those need to take the form of neighborhood assemblies, community meetings, local, decentralized, directly democratic forms of decision-making where people can actually take control of the decisions that are going to influence their lives and impact on them.
That gives real teeth to democracy. That democracy isn't just something we do every 4 years when we elect some other millionaire who's going to rule over us and capitulate like all the others, but actually if we want democracy, we need to return to the ancient Greek, Athenian understanding of democracy. When democracy was direct, we made the decisions ourselves. There was not this alien state, this coercive apparatus ruling over us, but we ruled ourselves. Self-governance rather than statecraft, something that's done to us. We do it ourselves.
And I know this may sound like a pipe dream to people, but in fact, I've seen it work.
For my father, even at the very beginning of his most prolific period of writing, which began, I would say, in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Even back then, he was thinking about how issues like, as I mentioned, domination and hierarchy, but how issues that transcended mere economic problems, such as, for example, urbanization and what it was doing to dehumanize people in everyday life in cities, how the problem of chemicals in food, radiation, polluted air and water, how those things were affecting people. And in this sense, that he really felt that we had to go beyond speaking to the proletariat and start speaking to people as citizens, as in everyday life. And he was also deeply concerned about what forms social organizing should take. So he began to develop this philosophy that he eventually called libertarian municipalism or communalism.
Communalism at its core is a politics of radical direct democracy. It argues that people should be in control of their own affairs, their own lives, starting at the local levels. So it articulates a politics that attempts to devolve power down to the local level and instilling power not in representative democracy as we have today, but rather in popular assemblies or some kind of local assemblies where people come together and they discuss the political affairs that affect their lives and decide these in common.
The way to put our ideals into practice, both in the here and now, in other words, building a new society within the shell of the old, and also to create a society that would be the most liberatory society possible, was to try and take the idea of power and of politics and bring it back to the local level, to devolve it down to the local level, to people, to everyday people in their lives. And so for him, communalism was the idea that you understand that power is always going to exist. It's not something that is going to dissolve. And the question is, in whose hands does power reside? Is it with the centralized state authority, or is it with people in their everyday lives?
While libertarian municipalism and communalism were not literally practiced in the past, there are many examples of directly democratic popular assemblies throughout the ages. Although most did not endure and were later transformed into often more hierarchical structures, they nonetheless are important in our understanding of how the system of power was foremost in the hands of the many, not the few. One such example is in ancient Greece in the 6th century. The year was 507 BC in Athens, Greece. A man named Cleisthenes introduced a system of political reforms he called demokratia, or rule by the people. Known today as the father of democracy, it's doubtful Cleisthenes realized how he would change history. It was a time of revolt and revolution. Angry from centuries of oppression by the leaders of Athens, commoners violently turned on their rulers, demanding freedom and a better way of life. After an exhausting battle, the people won by a surrender of the leader Isagoras. Cleisthenes, a nobleman by birth, realized that these ordinary people should have the chance to shape their own destiny and have a say in the decisions that affect their lives, essentially to govern themselves. Demokratia, from demos, the people, and kratos, meaning power, was comprised of 3 separate institutions. The ecclesia, or assembly, was the sovereign governing body of Athens. The meetings were held 40 times per year on a hillside amphitheater called the Nix. Of the 40,000 men, around 5,000, rich and poor, attended the meetings. Many decisions were made at these gatherings. War, foreign policy, and laws were just some of the decisions that were solidified by majority vote in the form of a white rock thrown into a pot for yes or a black rock for no. The Bouli, or Council of 500, was the second institution. Comprised of 50 men from each of the 10 Athenian tribes, their job was to run the day-to-day government tasks. The Buli's main function was to decide what matters would come before the ecclesia. Chosen by lottery, the council would hold their position for 1 year and could only join twice in their lifetime. The third and final institution of the Democratia is the Dicasteria, or popular courts. At the root, there was the magistrate. The magistrate was again a position any male citizen could run for and was chosen by lottery. The position was for 1 year, and the primary role was to decide if the accused would be fined or if the case would go to court. The court consisted of 500 jurors, once again chosen by lottery, whose job it was to hear the case from the plaintiff and defendant. Both had equal time to speak, and after both sides were heard, a vote by majority rule would bind the conclusion. Make no mistake, women, children, and slaves had absolutely no voice in the Democratia. Only adult males making up the 40,000 in Athens were welcome to attend the meetings of the Ecclesia, Buli, and Dicasteria. But this was a time of supreme patriarchy, and the important concept to acknowledge is that any and all adult citizens along class lines were welcome and their voices were equally heard. In addition to the significant historical record of direct democracy in Athens, there are several other examples of communalist political principles practiced in the past. Rome, in 133 to 121 BCE, where the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, representing the lower class or commoners, worked for land reform. Tiberius was the representative of the Roman masses. He tirelessly worked to redistribute land from the wealthy to the poor by constantly breaking Rome's political traditions of bringing new such laws to the Senate, and instead bringing it directly to the citizen assemblies to be voted on. This battle between the Senate and Tiberius eventually led to Tiberius's life coming to a brutal end. Gaius subsequently continued his brother's work for land reforms, but sought the support of poor men and equestrians alike to help champion his causes. Another of Gaius's notable campaigns was the enacting of laws that provided for the construction of state granaries to feed the citizens as well as the hungry and homeless of Rome. Like his older brother, Gaius's proposals were not popular with the power-hungry Senate. At a pro-Gracchi rally, violence ensued, and consequently the Senate passed Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a law that gave the Senate power to put any Roman citizen to death without trial. For Gaius, and any other Roman for that matter, suicide was more honorable than capture and execution, so Gaius summarily took his own life. 1520 AD. Before leaving Spain to assume his new position of Holy Roman Emperor, the bequeathed ruler Charles I passed several last-minute decrees, including additional arduous tax hikes and new duties on goods and property. Leaving these onerous decrees in the inept hands of a Dutch cardinal was the last straw for the comuneros, or communities, of Spain. Royal representatives, bureaucrats, and staffers were immediately detached, and the comuneros in city after city started organizing juntas, or unions, to form provisional governments. Initially, the goal was to reform, but not convinced there could actually be a good government, comuneros of Toledo moved forward with the radical idea of no legal government. This newly formed Congress of Cities was based on the idea not of coercion, but compromise. The comuneros created a working system of self-governed, independent city-states bound by the idea of mutual defense and complete autonomy. What naturally followed was the military campaign to crush a working people's free society and restore the hierarchical power of one. Centuries later, in a small remote area in northeast China called Manchuria, Korean refugees and exiles fleeing the Japanese invasion of Korea form the Shinmin Prefecture in March 1925. Of the 600,000 refugees in the prefecture, numerous anarchists and regrettably the nationalists, primarily for the regional base, formed guerrilla units seeking a new popular society that emphasized plans of autonomous agrarian systems of self-governance. This program was based on employing peasants and workers to act as delegates from each district to organize around 8 essential branches: self-defense, finance, propaganda, youth, food cultivation, health, education, and general affairs. The commune expanded auspiciously over the next 6 years until 1931, when the Japanese invaded Manchuria and installed a puppet government. In addition, the infighting between the nationalists and the anarchists increased and culminated the rift within the commune, which ultimately led to assassinations and finally the militaries of Korea, the Soviet Union, and China moving swiftly in to overrun it. Either by the tyrannical rulers with their thirst of domination and colonialization, powerful armies, or the internal disagreements of the organizers, these projects all violently fell. But there are very important lessons to be learned from these past attempts at a directly democratic form of self-governance, all of which have been and will be constantly studied. One such acutely examined case of a popular uprising in the hopes of a communalist society is the Paris Commune of 1871. The people of France have a long history of opposing tyranny that continues on today. Starting in the 18th century with the Great French Revolution, massive assaults were launched against the European monarchy that would change the face of the world. Again and again, the working class were called upon by leaders and the rich capitalists of France to defend their land and their interests. Each time the working class put forward their own demands, but were later betrayed by the wealthy leaders. The workers, tired of this nefarious game, began to understand the need to organize themselves independently as a class. In the 1860s, during a severe economic crisis in France, French workers striked and organized labor unions and Frenetic political clubs. The First International, a vast European organization of workers and revolutionary intellectuals, was formed in 1864 to defend workers' ideas and power. It had 70,000 members in France alone by 1871. In 1869, Louis Bonaparte, the French emperor at the time, led France into a disastrous war against Prussia. After losing battle after battle, France was brutally defeated and 80,000 French soldiers were forced to surrender to the victorious Prussian army. For 5 months, the ordinary citizens of France were in total agony. While Paris was under siege from German armies who proclaimed their union under the Prussian king, the working populace struggled to find food and ultimately subsisted on a diet of rats and sometimes horses just to survive. In response to several military defeats and the ongoing siege by the Germans, the people of France overthrew the Bonaparte monarchy. The remaining government, along with many rich nobles, abandoned their countrymen and fled to southern France to hole up. A republic, run by the ill-prepared capitalist class, was proclaimed in exile but failed to govern. The workers' revolt took charge. The vacuum created by the defeat of France led the National Guard, a workers-led city defense group that was separate from the regular French army, to elect delegates to a central governing body aptly named the Central Committee. The Central Committee, first and foremost, organized the strategic defense of the city. While the National Guard was attending to the immediate needs of the ordinary people, the exiled capitalist government was officially surrendering to Prussia. The government, trying to appease their new allies, allowed the Prussians to enter Paris as a conquering army. The National Guard was not about to let that happen. On March 18, 1871, the French army, acting on orders of the new Republican government, entered Paris to retake some cannons that were placed by the National Guard to defend the city. Led by the National Guard, the townsmen and women on their early morning errands blocked their path and held their barricade. Furious, the French generals gave the order to shoot the townspeople. The army instead laid down their arms, captured the two brutal generals, and summarily executed them. The army said they saw the National Guard as their brothers, not enemies of war. When the Republican government heard of this unfavorable debacle, they panicked and quickly fled to Versailles, fearing retribution. Meanwhile, the National Assembly in Versailles tried to pass more crushing laws to quash the local uprising, but those plans failed, only to sway more middle-class shopkeepers, tradesmen, and merchants into allying with the working class. The first task of the Paris National Guard, besides defending the city from outside attack, was to organize elections. The representatives were chosen by district, so the majority of the townspeople knew the candidates. The vast majority elected, after the remaining ruling class quickly forfeited their candidacies, were revolutionaries at the average age of 37 years old. Some would say this represented the youth and the future. What was unique about this election was all of those elected were recallable, and they were paid workers' wages, not exorbitant salaries. Devotion to the working class, not financial greed, embodied the thought behind this new governance. On March 26, 1871, 200,000 people came to the Paris City Hall for the inauguration of this historic Paris Commune. The Commune's goal was to be a citywide pro-worker and pro-feminist organization, with future goals of federation with other cities. They knew they needed to swiftly pass local laws, but also be responsible for those laws being carried out. Some of the most notable policies were: the army and police were abolished, and any citizen capable of bearing arms was enrolled in the National Guard. The schools were open and free for all. Rent was suspended during the German siege, and repayments were spread over 3 years with no back interest. Pawn shops were closed, and all items sold to them by hungry, skilled workers were returned. Night shifts were outlawed. Factories were to be run by the workers themselves. The conscription that forced the poor to fight the wars of the rich was abolished. The Commune repealed the grossly inflated Catholic Church budget and confiscated church property, making it national property, summarily separating church and state. The Commune established the 8-hour workday, came up with workmen's compensation for many dangerous jobs, canceled fines on workers for making simple mistakes, opened up culture like museums, galleries, music venues, and theater to the masses that in the past were only for the rich. Reading rooms were created in hospitals to make life a little better for those who were sick. Paris in 1871 was now filled with energetic activity. People were going to concerts, the theater, museums, attending street corner speeches, and reading from the packed news racks a plethora of books and newspapers. While ostensibly in a war zone, the local people were filled with joy, ideas, and a genuine enthusiasm for their lives. But a love for life and human freedom was too much to ask from a tyrannical, capitalist government. The French government back in Versailles tirelessly worked on their plans to isolate Paris from other French cities attempting the same bottom-up organizing. It was then that they prepared for a coordinated attack and overthrow. Consolidating the French army, Prussian troops, and 60,000 released French prisoners of war, the government of Versailles bombarded an unexpected Paris and entered the city on May 21st. The streets of Paris quickly turned into a bloodbath. On May 28, 1871, after an 8-day battle, later called the Bloody Week, the brave people of Paris took their final stand in Père-Lachaise Cemetery. The capitalist government, along with the rich landowners, expeditiously returned to Paris and gleefully cheered and watched the execution of a reported 30,000 citizens, the imprisonment of 45,000 men, women, and children, and the exiling of 30,000. Although the Paris Commune eventually fell, the deleted story from the French history books still reverberates loudly in the working class's ears today. Lasting for 72 days, the Commune showed what everyday citizen and workers' power can accomplish. That lesson, heeded by the French to this very day, will continue to develop, grow, and inspire others for generations to come.
Hot food, everybody! Hot food! Hot food!
A more recent history shows us that populations do in fact practice a sort of communalist praxis, oftentimes without even realizing or acknowledging it. For example, most of humanity does in fact instinctively default to cooperation instead of competition during a crisis or environmental disaster.
A new citizens group has risen from the ruins of Hurricane Sandy on the streets of Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. It's called Occupy Sandy, and it's offering help for the many whose homes and lives were upended in the storm.
We often see very little from leaders, but the very best from neighbors, family, friends, and complete strangers during these painful and trying times. Is it too implausible to recreate this same approach of communalistic mutual aid for present societies during everyday life?
I think here in the United States, we have to find a way to come together and practice a communalist politics that is not based simply on some kind of a catastrophe. It's great that, for example, during Hurricane Sandy in New York City, people came together beautifully. They called it Occupy Sandy, and really helped each other in ways that the state simply was uninterested in doing, from rebuilding to providing food. Those kinds of disaster responses are really wonderful, and they just show how profoundly ingrained in us mutual aid really is. But we have to build a movement that has strength in everyday life, not just during times of disaster or catastrophe. We have to build a movement that goes into every community, that talks to people in their homes, in their workplaces, in their schools, and that convinces people that this kind of a society in which we really are working together and politically charting our future together is a viable alternative. It's not only a viable alternative, it's really the only alternative, because what you see, what I think we're seeing right now is a situation in which people are grasping at anything that will help them feel like somebody is going to listen to them, that they're going to be empowered. The only real way to empower people is for them to become active participants in stewarding their futures. And so we have to go into the local school boards, we have to go to the commissions, we have to go to the neighborhoods where there are assemblies existing and talk about these ideas. And where there don't exist, we have to create them. And it can't be a politics based on disasters. I mean, one of the things that was really extraordinary about the United States in the 1960s and early 1970s is that it was a post-scarcity society, and that people had the ability, because they had the luxury of not worrying every minute about how they were going to survive and how they were going to earn money, because it was a much more egalitarian economy even back then. they had the ability to think creatively, and that's what led to the counterculture. And we have to reclaim some of the best qualities of that. We have to remember that this society under capitalism is not a given. There's no law that says that capitalism has to exist and that we all have to fight our way to survive in this, that we can create new communities and new forms and new economies, cooperative economies. And all of these things are important to do, I think. But I think that where my father would have said that we have to go beyond a kind of developing cooperative economies or just, separate sorts of educational institutions, is that we have to go into the political sphere. We have to do it with the idea that we're also going to go into city councils, and we are going to really try and wrest this power, create a dual power that is, in a sense, vying for power with the nation state, and that slowly tries to devolve that power back down to the local level. We can't just hope that people will be awakened in a disaster, that we have to really rely on education and on a commitment to begin to build institutionalize these forms of political change today.
From the smallest hardware store to the largest conglomerate.
On January 1st, 1994, then President of the United States, Bill Clinton, set into motion a treaty called the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA for short. Touted as a major victory for the Democratic president, it eliminated essentially all tariffs and trade restrictions between three nations, the United States, Canada, and Mexico. What wasn't in the official narrative, but was loudly proclaimed in protests all over North America, was the fact that this treaty gave corporations the freedom to flee the U.S. for Mexico, where they were free to exploit the people, the land, and resources for massive profits.
Under the NAFTA trade deal, that awful NAFTA trade deal over there.
For a small band of indigenous rebels, this was the catalyst that sparked an armed rebellion and a movement for autonomy in Chiapas, Mexico. From 1994 until the present, this experiment in anti-capitalism, bottom-up governance, and direct democracy has been the lifeblood for the communities of the Zapatistas.
Políticamente entendemos que el pueblo de México debe de ser de ellos y ellas la democracia. Y eso le estamos organizando y la exigimos que sea practicada. Nos tuvimos que formar un ejército del pueblo para que se haga real y se vaya haciendo realmente del pueblo la democracia.
The Zapatista Army of National Liberation, or EZLN, was named after Emiliano Zapata, a well-known advocate for land reform and a hero of the Mexican Revolution. Like Zapata, the Zapatistas have had to fight many battles with the Mexican government to keep their sovereignty. This framework that is so contested in Chiapas is one based on institutions that serve the community. The Zapatista design of political power, justice, healthcare, and education all have a bottom-up approach with a strong emphasis on women's empowerment.
Nosotras como mujer indígena también luchamos por la misma situación porque sufrimos la triple explotación por ser mujer, por ser indígena y por ser pobres. Por ser mujer no nos toman en cuenta. Somos humilladas, despreciadas. Por eso decidimos organizar y luchar juntas para salir en esta situación.
Political power is defined by the Zapatistas as self-governance applying a three-tiered system of decision-making. First, deliberations from men and women start at the village level. Then, a delegate carries those final decisions to the municipal level. When agreed upon, it is then carried forward to the regional level for approval with a strong insistence on consensus.
Es fácil dar orden, pero no lo hicimos así, porque así no será una democracia.
This type of three-tier decision-making carries over to the justice system as well. Based on a restorative approach rather than a punitive one, this method seeks to find a compromise between all the parties involved. The decision-making process here comes first from the elected authorities, then the communal assemblies, and last, the Honor and Justice Commission, or the Councils of Good Government. Police in the Zapatista communities are far different from what we know police to be. Zapatista police are not professional, uniformed, or armed. In addition, they are elected by their community for a term and are held to a respectful standard since they live in that community. While each village may have police, municipalities and regions do not. One of the elements paramount for a thriving society is healthcare. In Chiapas, the Zapatistas have developed their own healthcare system and are continuing to build more clinics for the growing need. Though help from non-Zapatista specialists continues, the community's local health promoters maintain most health issues using traditional and modern medicine. More advanced treatments can be sought out at the municipal clinics, as well as emergency services and technical health care. In some cases, non-Zapatista patients will seek out these autonomous institutions, for they have better reputations and quality of service than other Mexican health wards. Arguably, one of the most important systems to focus on in any autonomous project is education. Like the healthcare model and its health promoters, the education system is guided by education promoters. These education promoters are typically local youth supervised by an education committee elected by the local assemblies. Where most global education systems, you could argue, train children toward the path to a capitalist job paradigm with little to no insight on how to actually survive in the world, the Zapatista model does the exact opposite. The curriculum consists of true knowledge that is fundamental to the community. Subjects like autonomy, governance, self-sufficiency, history, veterinary medicine, and agroecology. This complex but rational system of the Zapatistas' anti-capitalist, directly democratic self-government and its institutions no doubt has to be funded. While striving for complete self-sufficiency and detachment from the state, the Zapatistas continue to finance this venture with earnings from its cooperatives and land collectives, with the ultimate goal of creating a new economy based on fair and mutual distribution of resources. The Zapatistas formed over a quarter century ago, and since then founded the National Indigenous Congress and the Indigenous Governing Council in Mexico. Together, they strive to assemble indigenous communities from all over the world to collaborate on political and social issues. While there is still a lot of work to be done towards complete autonomy, the Zapatista dream of a free society and a new Mexico are no doubt one step closer to reality.
Aquí estamos por conciencia. La gran paga que recibiremos un día es la de ver un día este pueblo que se llama México sea libre.
The Arab Spring. First ignited in Tunisia in December 2010 with protests against unemployment, oppression, and corruption against the authoritarian president Zine El Abidine Ben Ali, suddenly caught international attention with revolts billowing next into several neighboring countries, including Syria. When the Arab Spring stormed its way into Syria, the ethnic minority Kurdish in the north were confronted with a historically unique opportunity to create an autonomous region based on women's rights, ecological awareness, and bottom-up democracy. They call this region Rojava, meaning Western Kurdistan, also known as the Autonomous Administration of North and East Syria. To truly understand, we need to first examine the past of the Kurds and their political, social, and ecological awakening in this historically turbulent region. This expansive mountainous area, called Kurdistan, includes parts of Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Armenia, and Syria, and has been home to the Kurds since time immemorial. Regrettably, the aggressive repression of Kurdish basic rights, like speaking their own language and acknowledgement of their actual existence, goes as far back as the Ottoman Empire. But we'll start from more recent times. Over 50 years ago in the Turkish Republic, with the Revolutionary Youth Federation of Turkey, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, and Abdullah Öcalan.
So we are talking about the 70s, how Öcalan and some other young university students mainly from Kurdish backgrounds in the left, in Turkish left, they came to the conclusion that even the left, most people in the left in Turkey were not ready to recognize Kurdish existence, basically. So throughout, all the governments completely rejected any Kurdish rights. And Kurdish rights, I mean, we're just talking about speaking your own language, for example. They started debating Kurdish rights and realizing how Kurdish identity has been brutally suppressed under Kemalism. So everything from the very beginning, the movement was extremely secretive. So they had to invent all kinds of ways to basically stay alive and continue the movement. One of the points, for example, they focused on was the fact that Kurdish movement, there has always been Kurdish resistance in northern Kurdistan and the other parts of Kurdistan. But these movements were really never united, and they were played against each other by the colonial states, those being Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. So from the beginning, the PKK founders then tried to come up with a new way of doing politics, trying to give back the Kurdish personality, her confidence, her revolutionary confidence, and so on. Another thing they really focused on was, and this was also one of the main contributions of Abdullah Öcalan personally, the feminism and the emancipation of women, and how women must play their own independent role in the revolution from the beginning.
If you have any class of people, and especially women, who are not going to be liberated by your politics, then you do not have a liberatory politics at all. That was one of the things that Abdullah Öcalan says in his writing, and is very widely circulated within the Kurdish movement, his work on women's liberation, that basically it's women who are going to take the role that the sort of Marxist ideology once ascribed to the proletariat.
In 1978, they started, or they announced the PKK. At that time, this is a Marxist-Leninist revolutionary liberation movement. That and the main goal was the liberation of Kurdistan from colonialism. Then throughout the 80s, more or less, this kind of discourse continues. Around 1990, 1991, then the next couple of years, the debate kind of shifted to something else, giving up the idea of or the goal or the dream of an independent, united Kurdistan and so on. They started to move away from the whole idea of nation-state as such.
In 1997, the PKK and its founder, Abdullah Öcalan, was officially designated a terrorist organization by Turkey, the US, and the European Union. Trying to receive asylum in Kenya, Öcalan was summarily persuaded to leave in 1999 and board a Kenyan aircraft to a country of his choosing. Skeptical, Öcalan boarded the plane and was immediately abducted by Turkish MIT agents and flown back to Turkey for trial. He was expeditiously sentenced to death, but since Turkey abolished the death penalty, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Öcalan is still in a Turkish prison in solitary confinement.
But one person's terrorist is another's freedom fighter. So Öcalan is also known to millions of Kurds as simply the leader.
Later in the prison writings or prison notes, he talks about how a nation state, at best, it's a fascist state. You know, when it reaches perfection, it becomes a fascist state, and by definition, it's an institution for exercise of power. No matter, regardless to the facade, you know, you essentially, ultimately, a nation state is a tool for exercise of power. And then he realized, okay, we have all these nation states in the Middle East. Adding a Kurdish nation state is not really going to emancipate Kurds, because you look around, people with nation states, the majority of the people are not free. So again, around in the 90s, Öcalan became critical of the whole Soviet model, and he wanted something. He wanted a formula of a more kind of genuinely emancipatory form of direct democracy. So then in prison, when he reads Murray Bookchin, that's when he comes up with the whole picture. This is not a totally crazy utopic idea. Forms of confederalism have always existed in the Kurdish society. So in terms of communalism, so Öcalan's idea was we could go back to that history and selected the parts of how these communities organized themselves socially, politically, economically, and so on, and kind of extract those lessons and also learn what happened that led to the domination of men, which is the source of all forms of domination later. So this was really gradual, and they always focused on the idea of collective work, in terms of making important decisions, but also really lifestyles. That's one of the things that distinguished the whole PKK movement. So whether in northern Kurdistan, in Rojava, or in Iraqi Kurdistan, their way of doing things was extremely different than the other Kurdish parties. So everything was communal, everything was egalitarian. Yeah, I think one of the incredible and most important merits of this movement is its inclusiveness. It's inclusive in terms of ethnic backgrounds, religious identities, or affiliations, or their lack of, and gender, and so on. So it tries to be as egalitarian as possible. And if there is one revolutionary movement of intersectionalism, if you will, I would say it's the Rojava project.
So I was fortunate enough to spend several weeks in Rojava in the spring of 2019. And I got to see a lot of these concepts of democratic confederalism in action. And it's very exciting to be there. And I think people there also have been very excited and feeling empowered. And one of the things that the revolution has really aimed to do very strongly is to create this system of citizen assemblies. And so what they did is they kind of went around to basically every neighborhood, door to door, block by block, in every village, in every city and town in Rojava, and said, here's how you can get together, have a meeting, and as a group, it can be anywhere, it depends on the size of the community, it can be anywhere from like 40 families to even a couple of hundred families, depending on the size, and meet and talk about the issues that are important to you. And also they set up a very elaborate committee structure that's sort of alongside it. So people are meeting together in face-to-face assemblies, but they're also serving on committees on education, on all kinds of things, how to do economic development, and also even on like political ideology, and health, women's issues. But where there are decisions that are regional, they send delegates. And in keeping with this philosophy, they delegate people to essentially represent the will of the community. So they are very consciously steering away from professional politicians. For them, politics is something that is done by everyday people. And so a delegate who fails to represent the wishes of their assembly can be recalled and can be replaced. But these delegates go to the next level, which would be like the neighborhood level, and then from there they delegate further up to a kind of more regional level, and from there to the Rojava-wide level. There's a council, basically. And in each case, the delegates also report back, respectively, to their assemblies. And so in this way, again, politics is not professionalized. It's not viewed as something that's done by a professional class. It's viewed as something that's done in everyday life.
What happened in Rojava, again, it was not just a formula, then, okay, let's go and see how it works in reality. In 2000, as you know, in 2011, 2012, when the Syrian state basically collapsed in those areas, so these people were organized enough to take over. They had an idea what to do. They had the principles laid out. But there was a lot of improvement and advancement during those early years, really still. So 2011, 2012, 2013. By 2014, now they realize really how to do the horizontal structure, basically, as opposed to hierarchy. Really, the basic structure unit is commune. So every neighborhood has its own commune. Then the communes form councils. Then the council of the whole district. Then you have Tavdam, the whole the whole umbrella. But the idea of councils, so the whole idea of everything must be based on councils as opposed to what? Representation.
خسریه ملت به کومینان ج مجلس انتخابان مجلس باجاران ج همه سازی نوی خدمت گریدایوی لور ملت نرین خو ifade و پروژه خو پیشکش دکه جبر به ایدی خسری ناب سیستم کی خودی سازی دستلاتداری وکی دولتی.
So when this experiment of direct democracy started to take place in 2011, 2012, it was not that popular because the Kurdish society in Syria and the Arab society and the Assyrian society and so on, Turkish society in Turkey, these are, in my view, like really any society, they are conservative societies and traditions and religious values and whatnot. So in the beginning it was not a popular movement because this is a radical idea to tell people, no, you can do it better without the state. Because the whole idea of the state claiming that it keeps social order, this is so deeply seeded in us. It took a lot of work for these people, for the Rojava revolutionaries and the PKK revolutionaries and PYD and so on, to convince people around them, like, no, actually this is the only way of emancipation. Like, do you really think that if you don't have some form of policing, you're going around committing murder and so on? Or if you think about it, most of the problems we have are committed and the wrongdoings are committed because of the state in one way or another, because of the exercise of power, because of domination and hierarchy. So this took time, but these people deeply believe in education and they are very committed in education. So within few years the movement became quite popular, and as they went on, as they moved on, they learned also a lot, because you also have to defend yourself. There was all these attacks really by all sides. Rojava is living in a sea of fascism, literally, all sides, north, south, east, west. It's surrounded by fascist forces. So Syrian Kurds were left really with an existential crisis. So the options were go the Iraqi Kurdistan's way, typical national political parties, telling people what to do, how to do, when to go to war, when not to go to war, or seize this opportunity and implement direct democracy. Simply whatever language you speak, whatever religious affiliation you have or you don't have, whatever it is, your own community, you organize yourselves. You have your own communes. And these communes are then all connected horizontally. So this was the most revolutionary project one could think of. And it's working if Turkey leaves them alone. And that's the problem again. Then the question becomes, can you have, no matter how popular it is, can you have an experiment like that in a world of fascist states?
These experiments taking place in real time are monumental paradigm shifts, a grand deviation to the status quo. But can this transformation of society develop on a global scale? What can we do locally to start to build what is termed dual power and reverse humanity's forecasted collapse?
So the $10,000 question, as ever, is what is to be done? What can I do? And it can be overwhelming because the problems we face are local, but they're also global. As I mentioned before, libertarian municipalism offers a praxis that attempts to both offer a strategy for changing the world in the here and now, but one that also models the kind of society that we want to see. There's two broad avenues or strategies that social ecology, libertarian municipalism, communalism often discuss as ways of building what is called a dual power, a kind of alternate center of power that is in tension with the existing one, that attempts to erode, encroach on its legitimacy and ultimately take it over.
This dual power idea, I think, is a very critical part of this politics, and I think it has to be done beginning now.
So those two kind of broad avenues for libertarian municipalism, we might think of them as an inside versus an outside strategy. One, the inside strategy is running candidates using the electoral system as it exists, strictly on a local level, not with the idea of electing some heroic individual who is going to come riding a white horse and save us all, but rather with the idea that once they get into power, yes, they'll have good policies, they'll have good ideas, but more fundamentally, they're also going to change the structure of power, change not just the content of the policies, but the form, the way that power is arranged and held. They're going to change it from one person, one vote to devolving power to popular assemblies.
The idea that the people who would come from the neighborhood assemblies would essentially be delegates to the council and would be accountable, and that the politics would be transparent, and that if a person wasn't really following the will of the assembly, that person could be recallable, and that they would use their position, say in a city council, to continuously bring more power back down to the local level, that they would be essentially using their power to abolish, in a certain sense, their own position ultimately.
So basically taking the idea that has been nascent in movements from the altered globalization movement of the late 90s and early 2000s, especially here in Seattle, as well as the recent General Assemblies of Occupy Wall Street, that we're going to take these, and they're not only going to be organs where we make decisions for our small group as a movement, but we want to take those same principles and expand them to how we run cities, municipalities, states, nations, and then the world. We want to expand that. We want to offer that democratic impulse and institutionalize it to create a counter-politics. We don't want to take over the state as it exists. We want to transform that state away from a state. In fact, statecraft is the term we use for the existing state when politics is something done to us, to self-governance, to direct democracy, where we do it ourselves. The other main strategic avenue is to, rather than enter into the existing avenues of power on a local level, that we create extra parliamentary bodies. Now, these can happen in a variety of forms, and sometimes they'll probably reflect local conditions and local traditions. For example, in Detroit right now, they have certain neighborhood councils. In Portland, they have, I think they're called neighborhood wards, and these are essentially kind of small local community oversight boards. They have very little power, but there are libertarian municipalists working right now attempting to take these and use them to create a network of a counterpower.
On the local level, we see the possibility of creative thinking and of commitment to the communities, to the schools, to the air quality, to the water quality, that can be translated up and up and up until you are legislating for a much larger area. In fact, it's often the localities that do the things best that even the state claims to do. You know, sometimes we're seeing, for example, now with hurricanes and global warming, that the state often just doesn't come through for people. You know, the disaster relief that the state's supposed to be good at, they don't do it well. It's the local people who come through together, and they organize and they self-organize. And this whole process of self-organization is really critical to self-governance. What one hopes is that if people can start undertaking this process of organization on the local level, in which we do go into our neighborhoods and we talk to our neighbors and we set up local councils or local citizens' assemblies, shall we say, and we start to run candidates for office, and those candidates hopefully are elected on good platforms about ecological stewardship, platforms about a moral economy, platforms about economic equity, those kinds of things. But nonetheless are responsive always to the assembly, that little by little, as those kinds of neighborhoods assemblies grow and come into being in different parts of a city or town and in different parts of the country, that they can confederate with each other and eventually make a kind of a politics in which at every level, the next delegate up meets together and makes decisions about a region and an ever larger area.
Even the workers' movement 150 years ago, already the International Working Men's Association, however archaic we might find the language, organized across continents. And today with internet technologies, we should be able to do at least that, and we're lagging far behind the curve in this regard. But our movements have to be local, but they have to also be regional, national, international, global. So start where you're at. We can fight at the local level while confederating with others. This is a political vision that is, I think, quite inherently popular with people. It appeals to people. People don't want to live in an ecological hellscape. They don't want to slave away at crap jobs that are meaningless. They're destroying the planet and destroying their souls. They want to control their lives. They want to control their communities. So band together and make it happen. It requires social organization. We're, especially here in the West and the Anglo-American world in particular, it's perhaps the most individualist culture that's ever existed. So we have very limited experience of actual working socially with others, working cooperatively with others. So it's quite a challenge. But nonetheless, it must be done, because these kind of individualistic half measures that have been sold to us, especially in the last 50 years of we're going to consume our way ethically out of the problems of capitalism. We're going to vote with our dollars, in addition to voting every 4 years. We're going to blame poor people for being poor. We're going to blame immigrants for stealing our jobs. There's a multiplicity of ways where social problems, complicated social problems, are individualized. And then when they come to us, we're encouraged to fight them as individuals through our individual behaviors. We can all do that. We all should do that as individuals, but we have to also recognize that social problems require social responses. They require social movements. So communalism is very much about building radically democratic, ecological, anti-capitalist social movements that grow and grow and grow until they can build a dual power that replaces this existing rotten society and creates something much better.
So, agenda. Does anybody have anything to put on the agenda?
I would put NPI expansion.
Okay.
So this was a community gathering of residents of the Duwamish Valley that find that we're not being represented well by other groups, by the city, by either the city or the other nonprofit groups that work with the city. We've realized that we don't really have a voice anymore. The other groups have sort of aligned themselves with the city, and we no longer get information from them, and they don't talk to us anymore. And there's a lot of things happening in the community, and nothing's getting done. And so what we're doing is getting together to form a directly democratic community council where we can just talk about needs in the community and do something. And so instead of having the city come and tell us what's happening or have groups talk for us that haven't even spoken to us in years, we just really want to be able to kind of get action in a way that benefits the community, because the people who live here know what we need. We know what's going on, and we know what we need, and our needs are not met.
Cities and the public sphere have to become a public arena where we can highlight these problems and we can get at the underlying logics that are enforcing these decisions, which in many cases, especially today and here locally, is the logic of capital. This is a thorny question in the history of the left of how do we overcome that. And I don't want to offer some simple panacea, but I think we have to keep in the foreground of our minds and our political programs to challenge this idea that everything has to be profitable. That human lives are not ends in and of themselves. And this is the problem of capitalism. It does this it puts the cart before the horse. We're all working to serve this abstraction of the economy rather than making the economy serve us. Fundamentally, what social ecology wants to do, and this gets us back to the idea of libertarian municipalism, is we actually want to get rid of the economy as a separate social sphere. We want to just make decisions about what we want in a good life, not with some accountant sitting over our shoulder telling us what we have to do and what we can't do, because we take this artificial scarcity as exactly that. It's artificial. We do not live in a society of scarcity. Of course, there are natural limits, and of course, there are resources, and we will need these technical skills, computer programs, economists that will keep track of things and help us use them most rationally and make sure that we provision for the future. So this is something that we need to target in our communalist praxis, and when we enter into local democratic assemblies, and to fight at every step the hegemonic notion, the common sense notion that we simply can't afford these things, because of course we can, but it requires a much more fundamental rethinking of the economy. So we can start in a variety of places. So we might start, for example, by taxing corporations more so that they're paying their fair share. Maybe in the medium term about a universal basic income that, severs our ability to reproduce ourselves from our ability to sell our labor on the labor market. Organizing into economic cooperatives where we can experiment with different logics of production and consumption. We definitely, as far as existing concentrations of wealth are there, we need to break those up and decentralize them. But ultimately, we have to think bigger than this. We have to look at work being restructured on a much more radical level. Since the 1960s, we've had increasing automation. There's a lot of work that simply does not need to be done by humans anymore. Again, this should be an advance for humanity, but instead it just means that you can't eat or you can't have the good things of life. It would be very exciting if people could discuss how we want to spend that collectively produced wealth. It's not just produced by the Bezos and the Buffetts and the Soroses of the world. It's produced by all of us in common. So we have to fundamentally rethink this. We have to start thinking about severing ourselves from this internalized economist who's just always on our shoulder, always thinking rational cost-benefit analysis of everything we do. Not only is that an impoverished way of organizing the economy, it's an impoverished way of being. It infects our very subjectivities and how we think, how we see each other, how we see our families, how we see human relationships in terms of human capital, of investments. I'm too invested in this, or I'm not invested in that. So really capitalism has come to corrupt so many of our basic social relationships, so we have to really put that in the foreground of our politics.
So what gave you the idea for this directly democratic neighborhood assembly as well as a community-based economy?
I'd say what gave me the idea was through mutual aid, doing mutual aid projects and seeing the power in that, and I was like, holy crap, like everything should work this way, and so the world could be organized like this, and the community could be organized like this.
If we're going to adopt a more non-hierarchical economy, we must have a comprehensive knowledge of three terms: usufruct, irreducible minimum, and of course mutual aid.
Mutual aid, of course, being a form of mutualistic economics and social relations, in which we see that connection between each other, which is inherent, certainly as we saw earlier, in ecosystems themselves, and finds expression in human society through relationships of solidarity, where we share resources, where we help each other, where we make a point of expressing our solidarity through extending the kind of relationship that at least ideally is embodied in a nuclear family, where parents help children and relatives help each other, but instead it's extended out into the larger society, so that in essence, all of humanity, and certainly on the local level, our community, is seen as an extended family. And we have the same kinds of obligations to help each other through hard times, to share resources, and to stand in solidarity with each other. The notion of usufruct is really sort of in opposition to our hyper-possessive individualism and the kind of possessiveness that one sees coming to its fore under capitalism. The idea that this is mine and what's mine is mine. And what's yours is yours, and that's kind of an immutable, proprietarian outlook, which is once again reinforced by all of our legal structures and as well as our economic structures. The idea here is that in these societies, possession is much more fluid. Certainly individuals do have particular possessions, which are seen as extensions of themselves, but there's a larger category of artifacts, of various technologies, land base that everyone has access to. And it's certainly yours to use while you're using it. But when you're not using it, someone else has access to it as well. So it's a very different outlook on property, private property, that kind of possessiveness that's at the core of capitalism. Capitalism is all about accumulation. The more toys you have when you die, the more successful you are. It's a very different ethos from the one that expresses itself through the notion of usufruct. And the law of the irreducible minimum is, of course, something that's animated human society for almost the whole of its existence, and that is that the notion that every individual has the right to the bare minimums required for existence. Rather than someone hoarding resources, someone, say, killing a buffalo and then claiming all of that for themselves, it's seen rather as communal property. And there's no calculation involved. There's no buying or selling or trading. I gave you a buffalo, so you owe me this. Rather, there is the expectation that at some point, someone else is going to either gather food or kill a buffalo, and it will be shared equally with everyone else. And that's done in order to ensure that every individual in the community has access to the basic means of existence, the basic resources necessary for them to have a decent life. And it's rooted in the ethos of really from each according to their ability to each according to their need. There's no buying or selling, there's no market calculation at all involved. It's rather a recognition of our common humanity and an expression of mutual aid.
Yeah, of course, a common objection to any kind of, alternative, transformative vision of society is, well, that can't work. That's against human nature. It's never worked in history. And of course, if you talk to any anthropologist or any historian, they will tell you, of course, the historical record is complex. There's plenty of instances of, hierarchy, domination, etc. But there's also plenty of instances of people cooperating to live together and build communities that are not based on, such an extreme vision of hierarchy and competition. And this, in a way, I think is really one of the cruelest victories of neoliberalism. The ideology that Margaret Thatcher famously said in the 80s is, Tina, there is no alternative. We've reached the end of history. We're just going to have liberal capitalist democracy after the fall of the wall, the collapse of the state socialist societies, that, we're just going to tinker around the edges. We're going to have technocratic management by elite experts who know best. But basically it's smooth sailing from here on out. But I think those habits of thought die very hard, and we've had 40, 50 years of neoliberalism now where it's just been hammered into our brain that the only way of organizing human society is this one, that everything has to be marketized. We've internalized it. We think of ourselves as homo economicus, that whether it's in our relationships, we're competing with one another for jobs, for partners, for what have you, for social prestige. We're really competing with each other on the capitalist marketplace as well. And this is really, I think, if you take the long view, another perverse outcome of neoliberalism, is it's not only just changed our lifestyles, but it's changed just how we think of ourselves, how we think of each other. So it's very hard to imagine other examples. And of course, there's a variety of contemporary examples, however partial, however incomplete, because we still exist in this world of power and money and authority. But of course, movements like the Occupy Wall Street movement offered a little glimpse of how another world is possible, organized, collectively in Zuccotti Park, meeting each other's needs, organizing non-hierarchically, making decisions by consensus, or at least via direct democracy, giving the least a voice in the decisions of how we run our community. So of course, nobody wants to probably live long-term in a cold park in New York City, but it's more about the operational principles that were at play there, that this is how it could be elsewhere. Why do we settle for that there where we wouldn't here? So it's people call this prefigurative politics. We're trying to prefigure another way of doing things. And again, it's creating a counterfactual in the here and now. And this is, the dearth of utopian thinking over the last 50 years. I mean, and if you look at the slogans of the movements in the 1960s, especially famously the Situationists in Paris, all power to the imagination, beneath the paving stones, the beach, they had this very utopian sensibility where it was all about imagining what a different world might look like. And I think that social imagination is something that's been very severely degraded over the last 40 years as we've internalized these values. So that's really a difficult thing. So I think that's why it's so important that movements today, as well as art, as well as literature, as well as music, things, you can find sparks of utopia in all kinds of different cultural, in addition to political productions. So wherever folks find inspiration that they can imagine, it doesn't have to be this way. We don't have to rationalize the existing world of drudgery, exploitation, sexism, racism, hierarchy as the only operative principle that we could run a society by. We need to build forms of popular power that can assert our interests, that can build an ecological, cooperative, non-capitalist, non-statist form of society where people are empowered to live their lives free of these restraints.
Society is no doubt changing, even if times it seems ever so slowly towards anything positive. Around the globe, there are many pockets of resistance to destructive hierarchies and a predatory capitalist model. Right now, in our time, a vast imagination from like-minded people around the world envisioning a greater future for humanity and the planet. From the neighborhood activists at the Georgetown Assembly in Washington State and Cooperation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, to the populist canton of Glarus, Switzerland, and citizen assemblies of Maribor, Slovenia, people are rising up. Many of those valiant efforts to raise us out of this life's drudgery are in fact still thriving today.
It's about having that conversation first, then educating ourselves on what the issues are, and then coming to a conclusion collectively on how to solve these issues.
The system that trained us to be this way, we have to start with our own rhetoric.
But some of those noble struggles have admittedly failed.
If we really are about changing this shit, it starts with each and every single person here today.
Besides, of course, the state's repression of such ideas, what I believe primarily lacked in some of those experiments was a common theory or roadmap for how to create a better world and the broad organization of a united population.
Educate them. That is the only way this works, okay? We're all our own leaders.
Now, will we ever see a new, comprehensive, rational, and vigorous society in our lifetime? I truly don't know, but I do believe it will take a humanistic realization of our authentic role on this planet, a new paradigm of real-life social connectivity and community. We all have a choice. Either we choose a path of destruction brought on by the oligarchs' insatiable appetite for control and infinite growth on a finite planet, or we forge a new trail utilizing our vast intellect, acquire thorough knowledge and critique, along with ceaseless practicing of this bold theory of social ecology, libertarian municipalism, and communalism.
The metaphor of an oak tree and an acorn is a really beautiful, easy way to kind of explain how an acorn is a structure, it's an organic structure, has structural logic to it that holds within it the potentiality for an oak tree. And what's really important here is the word potentiality. There's nothing determined within an acorn that means that the acorn will inherently, definitively, necessarily become an oak tree. In fact, most acorns don't ever become oak trees. So there's this beautiful organic metaphor in the acorn as it's structurally composed in a way that opens the way for a potential development. And that's true for when we think about the society we live in as being kind of an acorn, that we hold the potentiality for being a better, more ethical society, more rational, more humane, more democratic, more socially just society. We look at an acorn and we know there is actually structural logic that makes this opening of potentiality to create shoots and roots and a sapling, and maybe if it gets enough light and it's right kind of conditions, can actually become an oak tree. And the oak tree is important because, again, when in social ecology, we care not just where we are, but where we're trying to head. And in that way, the oak tree is kind of a metaphor for the good society. It's not definitive. We don't know how big it's going to be, what that oak tree will exactly look like, but we know it has the potential to get to that tree or that good society.
Time is inevitably passing like the seasons. Communities of people can have a vision of a more just society. Not unlike acorns, the potentiality for something new, something extraordinary. Right now, it's up to all of us to make sure we cultivate, germinate, and become an entity so magnificent we're able to withstand the barrage of storms that will surely follow. As the great author and political philosopher Murray Bookchin once said, "If we do not do the impossible, we shall be faced with the unthinkable." Our time is now.
And no cops. Everyone there has everything they need: food, water, shelter, and mops. People there can garden in the morning, then they garden in the afternoon. People there sing and dance in the evening, freely doing what they want to do. People there participate